What if the person you just disrespected turned out to own everything you depend on? This isn't just a story. It's a wake-up call about power, presence, and the quiet strength people often overlook. In the next few minutes, you'll see how one woman flipped the script without raising her voice, and changed everything. Stay until the end, because the final moment will leave you stunned. Like this video, subscribe now, and let's talk about what real power really looks like. Richard Coleman ran his upscale restaurant like it was his personal clubhouse. Everything about it, from the velvet menu covers to the jazz humming through the speakers, was designed to feel exclusive. Not necessarily welcoming, especially if you didn't fit into the unspoken image he had in mind. For years, no one really challenged that vibe. It was subtle, just enough to slide under the radar. But one evening, that changed. Ariana Blake and her best friend, Maya Carter, arrived for dinner. It was one of those golden Atlanta afternoons, the kind where the light stretches long and soft across the skyline. Ariana, always poised, stepped out of her car with quiet confidence. She didn't need to announce herself. Her presence did all the work. Maya, vibrant and full of energy, caught up beside her, cracking a joke and adjusting her earrings as they approached the front of the restaurant. They didn't have a reservation, but the restaurant wasn't full. You could see a few open tables through the windows, and it wasn't hard to imagine a short wait, maybe 10 or 15 minutes tops. The young host seemed ready to seat them without hesitation. He was polite and professional, reaching for menus, clearly treating them just like any other walk-in. But that's when Richard stepped in. Not with a scene, not with raised voices, just a quiet word to the host, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and suddenly, the story changed. The menus were pulled back. The host's demeanor shifted. Suddenly, the wait was going to be an hour. The kitchen was backed up, they said. No exceptions, no apologies, just a firm dismissal, wrapped in polite language. Ariana didn't protest. She simply said they'd wait. It was the kind of response that threw Richard off more than any confrontation could have. She wasn't loud. She didn't argue. She just stayed, still, calm, and unmistakably present. Maya, on the other hand, was clearly frustrated, watching as other guests walked in after them. White couples, younger groups, only to be seated within minutes. As the minutes ticked by, it became impossible to pretend the situation was anything but intentional. The host avoided eye contact. Richard disappeared into the kitchen. Staff moved around them like they weren't even there. Ariana and Maya, dressed sharply, carrying themselves with grace, stood out for one reason and one reason only, and it wasn't their clothes or their attitude. They were being ignored not because of any actual policy, but because Richard decided they didn't belong. In his mind, two black women couldn't possibly align with the image he was trying to maintain. It wasn't about space. It wasn't about food. It was about control. And in that moment, he believed he had it. What he didn't know was that Ariana wasn't just another woman hoping to enjoy a nice dinner. She was his landlord. She owned the building his restaurant sat in. And while he thought he was turning away just two more guests, what he was actually doing was drawing a line in the sand he couldn't walk back from. She let it all play out. The lies. The dismissiveness. The smug little gestures that told her everything she needed to know. Because Ariana believed in patience. She understood that some messages don't need to be delivered in the moment. They're more powerful when they come with context, with timing, and with consequences. And in that quiet moment by the host's stand, while Richard thought he was winning, Ariana had already decided how this story was going to end. Ariana Blake had always believed that real power didn't come from how loud you could be in a room. It came from knowing you didn't have to speak at all to change everything inside it. So when she and Maya were quietly turned away from Richard Coleman's restaurant, she didn't need to respond with drama or confrontation. She simply stepped aside, waited, and let the truth gather weight. What Richard didn't know in that moment, and what would eventually undo him, was that Ariana wasn't just another customer. She was the person who held the lease to the very ground his restaurant stood on. Years earlier, when Ariana had purchased the building through her company, Warren Equity Group, it wasn't a flashy move. She didn't plaster her name on the door or make a public announcement. She wasn't looking for attention. She was looking for opportunity, solid properties in growing areas, where she could foster spaces that added value to communities and quietly expand her reach. The restaurant was one of several tenants. At the time, Richard had been offered a continuation of his lease at a discounted rate, a courtesy extended through the transition from the previous owner. He had no idea the woman who signed off on those papers would one day stand in front of his host's stand, unrecognized and unwelcome. After that night, Ariana didn't call him. She didn't send an angry email or request a meeting. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached out to her property manager, Jamal Reed, and asked for a full rent audit. She wanted to see exactly how much Richard's business had benefited from her quiet generosity over the past 2 years. The answer wasn't surprising. His rent was nearly 20% below market value, a legacy rate that no longer made sense, especially not after the way he treated her. She reviewed the numbers, not with emotion, but with clarity. She understood how this would look from the outside if it ever became public. A landlord raising the rent on a local business always risked being framed as greedy or out of touch. But she also knew the facts were airtight. The lease had expired the previous quarter. Richard had been operating month to month since then. And legally, she had every right to adjust the rent to match current market conditions. So she did. A 42% increase, effective in 30 days. No fanfare. No explanation. Just a clean, professional notice delivered straight from her office. Ariana didn't expect Richard to take it well. Men like him rarely handled disruption with grace, especially when they didn't see it coming. He thought he had power because he owned a successful restaurant. Because people knew his name. Because he could control who walked through his doors. But what he failed to realize was that none of that mattered if someone else held the keys to the building. And Ariana held them without ever needing to raise her voice. The moment the rent adjustment hit his inbox, Richard panicked. He called. He left messages. He tried to set up a meeting. He didn't recognize the name on the letterhead, Jamal's signature, not Ariana's. So he assumed he could still fix this with charm, with persuasion, with the confidence he'd used for years to stay in control. But this time, charm wouldn't help him. The damage had already been done the night he made Ariana wait in her own building and treated her like she didn't belong there. By the time Richard was sitting across from Ariana in a conference room 2 weeks later, it all started to click. She greeted him calmly, professionally, her expression as composed as it had been that night at the restaurant. He stammered through excuses, tried to justify the experience, tried to argue that the rent hike was personal. But Ariana didn't need to argue. She laid out the lease. The expiration dates. The rate comparisons. The months of underpaid rent that had been quietly tolerated until now. And when he finally realized who she was, that she wasn't just a woman with a complaint but the actual owner of the building, his entire posture shifted. Because the truth landed in one sharp, undeniable moment. He had turned away the very person who had the power to change everything about his business with a single signature. Ariana didn't gloat. She didn't need to. All she did was uphold the terms. Professionally, legally, and with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to be loud to be in charge. For Richard, that was the beginning of the unraveling. For Ariana, it was simply business, handled with precision, patience, and the full weight of ownership. By the time Richard Coleman realized how deep he was in, it was already too late. He had treated Ariana Blake like she was invisible, and now she was quietly, methodically reminding him that she wasn't just present, she was in control. After their tense meeting in the conference room, where she laid out every legal document with the calm of someone who'd been preparing for this moment long before it arrived, Richard walked away shaken. He thought he could spin the situation to his advantage, thought he could lean on public sympathy and community ties to pull himself out of the hole he had dug. But Ariana wasn't playing the same game. He began with whispers. A few carefully chosen words to regulars, a couple of social media posts sprinkled with just enough ambiguity to sound innocent but stir doubt. He told a version of the story that made him look like the victim, the local restaurant owner being squeezed out by a faceless corporation. He never said Ariana's name. He never mentioned what really happened that night or the lawsuit he filed and lost. He just played the role of the underdog, fighting against rising rent and greedy developers. It didn't take long for the story to spread. People were quick to rally behind him, reposting clips and comments, turning their frustration about gentrification and commercial development into fuel for his cause. Protest signs went up. Small rallies formed outside Warren Equity's building. Hashtags started trending. And through all of it, Ariana stayed silent. She watched as the narrative twisted, as strangers painted her as the villain, and she let it happen. Not because she was helpless, but because she was waiting for the right moment. While Richard stood outside with a megaphone shouting about injustice, Ariana was inside, reviewing documents, balancing spreadsheets, and finalizing plans. She knew that attention was fleeting. Public outrage is loud, but it's also short-lived. People move on. What lasts are facts, contracts, and decisions that hold up in court. So instead of responding to the noise, she focused on the next step, reinforcing the legal boundaries she'd already drawn. She knew Richard wouldn't be able to keep up with the rent hike. The numbers didn't lie. His business had been skating by on the discounted rate she'd extended through courtesy, not obligation. With the new market rate in effect, it was only a matter of time before the cracks showed. And when they did, there would be no more leniency. Still, she stayed quiet even as Richard amped up the drama. He went on local radio. He made videos. He positioned himself as a small business owner under attack. But behind the scenes, his restaurant was suffering. The new customers he'd hoped would pour in out of solidarity never materialized. The regulars began to thin out, uncomfortable with the tension, the half-truths, and the energy that had shifted inside the space. Staff started quitting. The food wasn't what it used to be. The place felt different, not exclusive, just heavy. And then one morning, with the timing only Ariana could have planned, she released a single post. A clear, calm, detailed account of everything, starting from the moment she stepped into the restaurant, to the lease terms, to the lawsuit, and the judgment. She included scanned documents, timelines, and a statement that cut through every bit of spin Richard had tried to use against her. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was just the truth, laid out simply and cleanly for anyone who cared to read it. The effect was immediate. People who had jumped on Richard's bandwagon started deleting their comments. Some apologized. Others just quietly backed away. The protest fizzled out. The hashtags stopped trending. And Richard, who had spent weeks yelling into a storm of his own creation, was left standing in the silence he didn't know how to fill. Ariana never gloated. That wasn't her style. What mattered to her wasn't proving a point to the internet. It was restoring order, making sure the facts spoke louder than the fiction. She didn't want revenge. She wanted clarity. She wanted to show that dignity didn't need a microphone, and that sometimes the best response wasn't a fight, it was a well-executed plan carried out with purpose. And that's exactly what she delivered. Ariana Blake understood something that Richard Coleman never quite grasped. When you really hold the truth, you don't have to rush to defend it. You let it settle. You let the noise burn itself out. While Richard pushed his version of events into the world with all the energy of a man trying to erase his mistakes with volume, Ariana sat still. She wasn't hiding. She was listening, observing, letting him make his story loud enough to be noticed, but also flawed enough to eventually fall under its own weight. Richard had momentum. After Ariana's rent adjustment pushed him into financial discomfort and the court ruling didn't go his way, he went full force into damage control by telling a version of the story where he was the victim. He painted Ariana and her company, Warren Equity Group, as corporate villains out to destroy small businesses in the name of profit. He never told the full truth, of course. He left out the part where he'd turned her away from a restaurant she owned the building for. He omitted the moments of open disrespect, the lawsuit he lost, and how his rent had been below market for years. His story was edited carefully to evoke sympathy, not facts. He shared videos online, looking solemn in front of empty dining tables. He talked about community, about culture, about how unfair it was to be forced out of a place he had helped build. His words struck a chord with some people who had their own frustrations with rising rents and changing neighborhoods. And soon, the story wasn't just his anymore. It was being echoed across platforms, reshared by local bloggers, picked up by influencers, even making its way into small news outlets that didn't ask too many questions before running with a good headline. People started protesting. A small group showed up outside Warren Equity's offices, holding signs and live-streaming their chants. They shouted about greed, about justice for small businesses. It was noisy, dramatic, and at times, even theatrical. Inside, Ariana stayed focused. Her team continued with their regular meetings. No one panicked. No one rushed to issue a press release or fight back on social media. The facts were still on their side, and Ariana knew the truth didn't need a spotlight, it just needed the right moment. That moment came quietly one morning. Ariana posted a single thread online. It wasn't flashy or emotional. It was calm and complete. She laid out everything: how she and her friend were treated that night, how she had owned the building for 2 years, how Richard's lease had expired and the rent adjustment was standard procedure. She included legal documents, court rulings, and copies of the original lease. There was no attack in her tone, no need to defend her character. Just a series of facts that painted a full, undeniable picture. And people listened. The shift was immediate. Those who had jumped to Richard's defense started to hesitate. Some deleted their posts. Some apologized publicly. Others just went quiet, unsure what to say now that the full story was out. The news outlets that had run the first version of events started updating their articles or pulling them all together. The protest in front of her office vanished. One day it was a crowd with signs, and the next, it was just silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that came from defeat. It was the kind that followed truth, still and lasting. Ariana never once raised her voice. She didn't have to. Her quiet refusal to play Richard's game had become the loudest response of all. And now that the public saw the full picture, they realized what Ariana had known all along. This wasn't about a rent hike. It wasn't about saving a small business. It was about a man who thought he could get away with disrespect and spin a story to cover it. Ariana's calm dismantled his campaign piece by piece, without shouting, without spectacle, just with truth. She didn't win by force. She won by waiting, by trusting that what's real doesn't need to be exaggerated. In the end, Richard had relied on noise. Ariana relied on clarity. And when the noise faded, only one story was still standing. Richard Coleman had built his restaurant on charm and control. 4 years, he curated every detail, from the lighting to the playlist, to create a space that felt exclusive, like a club where only certain people belonged. That sense of control gave him confidence, even arrogance. He believed that as long as he kept up appearances, his business would always thrive. But what he didn't see coming was how quickly that illusion could fall apart when the real foundation, respect, fairness, and humility, was missing. After Ariana Blake shared the full story online, the shift was almost immediate. The attention Richard had been feeding on turned cold. Supporters who had once reposted his videos quietly stopped engaging. The outrage faded. The hashtags stopped trending. And as the noise died down, the truth Ariana had calmly delivered stayed behind like a quiet echo that people couldn't ignore. The court documents, the lease terms, the reminder that he had turned away the very woman who owned the building, all of it settled into the public consciousness in a way that no amount of spin could undo. Inside the restaurant, the impact was even more visible. The dining room that once buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses became a shell of its former self. Weeknight dinners turned into empty tables. Weekend reservations slowed to a trickle. His regulars, people who once came without needing a menu, started disappearing. Some had seen the story. Others just felt the shift in energy. The warmth was gone. The ease, the welcome, the atmosphere that made the place special. It had all been replaced with something heavier. Something uncomfortable. The staff felt it too. The turnover increased. Morale dropped. Richard, usually polished and composed, became tense and irritable. He cut hours, trimmed the menu, avoided eye contact. Even Monique, his longest-serving waitress, gave notice. Not out of anger, just exhaustion. The stress, the awkward conversations, the quiet judgment that hung in the air like smoke, it was too much. She told him she needed something more stable. And deep down, Richard knew she was right. The bills started stacking up. The new rent rate was crushing. Ariana had given him time, but the grace period was over. He was behind, And the payment deadlines weren't suggestions, they were firm. His savings dried up faster than he expected. The campaign he'd hoped would generate support didn't turn into foot traffic. Protesters didn't become paying customers. The influencers who reposted his story never booked a table. And the customers who did show up seemed unsure of the place now, glancing around like they were waiting for someone to explain the tension in the room. Each month, the restaurant edged closer to the line. Vendors started holding deliveries until payments cleared. Maintenance issues went unfixed. The place, once spotless and refined, started to feel worn. And through it all, Richard kept thinking it wasn't supposed to end this way. He had worked hard. He had built something. But it was slipping through his fingers, and the more he tried to hold on, the faster it unraveled. Eventually, the final notice came from Warren Equity Group. It was simple and direct. The rent was still unpaid. The lease was terminated. He had 30 days to vacate. There were no arguments left to make. No audience to plead with. Just the quiet process of letting go. On his last night inside the restaurant, Richard stood alone, surrounded by half-packed boxes and echoes of better nights. He looked around the empty dining room, the one he used to show off like a trophy, and saw what it had become, not just a failed business, but a reflection of choices he made when he thought no one was watching. The pride that once fueled him had turned into a weight he couldn't carry. He had turned away someone he should have respected, tried to control a narrative he didn't own, and lost everything trying to prove he was right. Upstairs, in her office overlooking the same block, Ariana didn't watch him leave. She didn't need to. Her work was already moving forward. New plans. A new tenant. A space ready to be filled with something better. Something rooted in belonging instead of exclusion. For her, this wasn't about revenge. It was about clearing space for what came next. And for Richard, the fall wasn't about one mistake. It was about the moment he chose his pride over his future and let it cost him everything. The old restaurant space stood empty for a few weeks after Richard Coleman handed over the keys. The silence that filled it wasn't heavy with loss, it was full of possibility. Ariana Blake didn't rush to renovate. She gave it time. Let the air settle, the walls breathe, and the energy shift. This wasn't just about putting in new lighting or repainting the walls. It was about intention. About rebuilding the space with care, purpose, and a vision that had nothing to do with exclusion and everything to do with welcome. The first thing Ariana did was bring in local artists and community members to talk about what the neighborhood actually needed. Not what investors wanted, not what looked trendy on social media, but what felt real, sustainable, and rooted. She listened more than she spoke. She took notes. And when the final concept began to take shape, it was something entirely different from what had existed before. Urban Indigo, the new cafe that would take over the space, wasn't going to be another upscale, velvet-rope dining experience. It was going to be a place where people felt seen the second they walked through the door. A cafe with bright light, open seating, and the smell of fresh herbs drifting from the kitchen. A place where you could find a book of poetry on the table next to your tea, or hear a live jazz trio warming up in the corner while a kid in a hoodie sketched in a notebook. Ariana didn't just approve the plans. She helped design the space herself. She walked through every inch, choosing details that mattered. The mural that would stretch across the back wall featured 3 black women gathered around a simple table, their expressions calm and powerful. No glamour, no pretense. Just presence. Strength. Connection. She wanted people to feel that energy the moment they stepped in. Like they belonged, without needing to prove anything. By the time the soft opening arrived, word had already spread. Not through paid ads or big media write-ups, but through conversations. Through neighbors telling neighbors. Through local students peeking through the windows during build-out and sharing it on their stories. People were curious, excited, hopeful. Not just about the space itself, but about what it represented. The first day was gentle and beautiful. Families came in with strollers. Couples shared breakfast sandwiches and coffee. Elders from down the block claimed their favorite corner table by the window. And throughout the day, people smiled more than they spoke, as if they were all breathing easier, feeling something shift beneath their feet. Ariana stood near the back, not in the spotlight, but watching with quiet satisfaction. Maya Carter joined her, 2 cups in hand, one labeled with Ariana's name in chalk on the side. A turmeric ginger tea, named after her without her asking. That's how the staff chose to honor her. Softly, subtly, through warmth. The vibe was nothing like the space that had come before. It wasn't about trying to impress anyone. It was about connection. Safety. You didn't need to dress a certain way or speak in a specific tone. You just had to show up. The space welcomed everyone, but especially those who had spent too long walking past places that made them feel like they didn't belong. Outside, new flyers fluttered on the window glass. Local events. Open mic nights. Art shows. Everything about Urban Indigo was designed to include, to uplift, to invite. It wasn't loud about being black-owned, but it didn't have to be. The energy said it all. The faces behind the counter, the music playing softly in the background, the food seasoned with history and love, every piece was a quiet declaration of presence. Ariana didn't open the cafe to prove anything. She opened it because the city needed more spaces like this. More spaces where people could feel at home. Where being yourself wasn't a risk. Where ownership didn't mean gatekeeping, it meant giving. Urban Indigo wasn't just a cafe. It was a statement. A restoration. A reclaiming of space that once told people they weren't enough and now reminded them that they always had been. It was Ariana's answer to a door that had been closed in her face. She didn't knock again. She built her own. And this time, it stayed open. By the time Urban Indigo had found its rhythm, the story of what came before it had faded into the background for most. The neighborhood moved on, the block evolved, and life settled into a new normal. But for Ariana Blake, it was never about erasing the past, it was about transforming it. The journey from that uncomfortable night in Richard Coleman's restaurant to standing in a space filled with warmth, laughter, and community had never been about revenge. It had always been about setting the record straight, on her terms. She didn't need to remind anyone what had happened. The ones who needed to know already knew. The court had ruled. The paperwork was clear. The truth had been documented and shared, and then Ariana let the silence do what it does best. Let facts speak louder than noise. While Richard tried to rally people around a version of the story shaped by pride and half-truths, Ariana focused on building something that would last beyond the headlines. She had understood from the very beginning that power wasn't about making someone pay. It wasn't about humiliating or controlling. It was about knowing you could move forward without carrying bitterness. She never wanted to win an argument. She wanted to create change. That's why when the last of Richard's supporters stopped showing up, when the social media campaign fizzled out, when the protest signs were tossed in the trash, Ariana didn't celebrate. She kept working. Quietly. Consistently. With care. What mattered wasn't that she had been right. It was that she used her position to make space for something better. Something welcoming. Something real. And that's what Urban Indigo became. A place not just for coffee and conversation, but for healing. For reconnection. For rewriting the story of what community spaces could look and feel like when everyone was truly invited. There was no need to tell customers the history of the building. Most of them didn't ask. Some vaguely remembered the restaurant that had been there before, but few brought it up. They were too busy enjoying what existed now. Families came to the cafe after school. Couples lingered on Sunday mornings. Local artists hosted events. Students worked quietly in the corners, headphones in, sipping tea. And all of it existed because Ariana refused to accept the version of herself that Richard once tried to project. Someone invisible, someone unworthy of a seat. That had been the root of it all. Not the lawsuit. Not the rent. But the moment a man looked at her and decided she didn't belong. That moment, more than anything, had defined the path forward. Because instead of demanding a seat at his table, she chose to build her own. And in doing so, she made it clear, her power didn't need an audience. It didn't rely on outrage or applause. It was steady, deliberate, and deeply grounded. Every decision she made during that time had been measured. Not because she lacked emotion, but because she valued impact. She let the facts do the talking. She let the paperwork speak. She let the silence hold weight. And when the time was right, she told the story, just once, with enough clarity that it didn't need repeating. Even now, months later, she didn't speak of it often. Occasionally, a reporter would reach out, hoping to revisit the saga. She always politely declined. The work she was doing now mattered more than the drama that had passed. There were new properties, new tenants, new projects in motion. Spaces to restore. Stories to rewrite. Opportunities to give others what she had created for herself, a place to belong without asking permission. She often said that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet. It moves like water, slow, steady, carving paths over time. And that's what she became. A quiet force. Not loud, but unshakable. In the end, Richard's story had been about holding on. Ariana's had been about letting go and moving forward. That was the final message. Not a loud declaration, but a lived truth. She didn't need to control the narrative anymore. She had already rewritten the ending. Not with noise. Not with anger. But with presence. With purpose. And with a cafe full of people who knew, without ever having to ask, that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Life doesn't always reward the loudest voice. It often honors those who move with purpose, patience, and integrity. Ariana's journey reminds us that real power is not about domination or revenge, but about standing firm in your truth and allowing time and action to reveal character. In a world that often demands quick reactions, her calm strategy shows the strength in letting the facts speak for themselves. She teaches us that dignity and control don't need to be performed. They're lived, quietly and consistently. For older audiences especially, this story echoes a truth many have come to understand, that the most lasting influence comes from how you handle adversity, not how you retaliate. It's about choosing growth over ego, restoration over retaliation, and knowing that grace can be stronger than confrontation. Whether in business, family, or community, how we carry ourselves in moments of challenge defines the kind of legacy we leave behind. If this story moved you or gave you something to think about, drop a comment below and let us know what types of stories or life lessons you'd like to see next. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and hit subscribe so you won't miss more powerful, meaningful content like this. We're building a space for real stories and real impact, and your voice helps shape it.